The sun was setting over the city skyline as attorney Rose Collins gathered her papers from her desk, carefully tucking them into her leather briefcase. The clock on her office wall showed 7:15 p.m. Another long day at the downtown law firm where she'd built her reputation over the past decade. The ordinaire carried a slight chill as it whispered through the partially open window, rustling the Attorney of the Year certificate hanging proudly on her wall. "You're still here?" called out her colleague from the doorway. "Girl, you need to learn how to clock out sometimes." Rose smiled, adjusting her navy blazer as she stood up. "Just wrapping up the Henderson case files. You know how it is, one more document always turns into 20 more." The office had that peculiar evening silence, broken only by the distant hum of vacuum cleaners as the cleaning staff began their nightly routine. Rose's heels clicked against the marble floor as she made her way to the elevator, nodding goodbye to the security guard who'd been watching over the building since she was just a first-year associate. "Drive safe, Ms. Collins," he called out with a warm smile. "Weather report says there might be some rain coming." "Thanks, Mr. Thompson. You have a good weekend, too." The parking garage was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered across the concrete expanse. Rose's silver sedan waited in its usual spot, a reliable companion through countless late nights and early mornings. As she settled into the driver's seat, she couldn't help but smile at the small photo tucked into her dashboard, her grandmother beaming proudly at her law school graduation. "Almost done, Grandma," she whispered, touching the photo gently. "Just one more big case, and we might finally get that community center you always dreamed about." The radio hummed softly as she pulled out onto the street, playing an old soul song that reminded her of Sunday afternoons in her grandmother's kitchen. The city was transitioning from its workday rush to its evening rhythm, restaurant signs flickering to life, couples walking hand in hand, food delivery cyclists weaving through traffic. Rose's mind wandered to the upcoming week. The Henderson case was bigger than anything she'd handled before. A class action lawsuit that could help dozens of families in her old neighborhood. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister. "Don't forget Sunday dinner. Mom's making your favorite." The familiar route home took her past the community center where she'd spent countless hours as a teenager. Now closed and boarded up, it stood as a silent reminder of why she'd chosen this path. Her grandmother had volunteered there for 20 years, helping kids with homework and teaching them to stand tall in a world that often tried to push them down. At a red light, Rose reached into her briefcase for a mint, her fingers brushing against the worn leather journal her father had given her when she passed the bar exam. "Write down your victories," he'd said, "but never forget the fights that got you there." The streets were quieter now as she entered her neighborhood, the same area where she'd grown up. She'd chosen to stay, even as success offered opportunities to move elsewhere. "You can't lift as you climb if you're too far from the ground," her grandmother used to say. Streetlights cast long shadows as Rose drove past the local diner where she'd studied for her LSATs, fueled by endless cups of coffee and the encouragement of Miss Betty, the owner who'd slip her extra fries for bring food. The open sign still glowed warmly in the window, a beacon of consistency in a changing world. Her phone's GPS chimed, warning of construction ahead. "Take alternate route," the robotic voice suggested. Rose sighed. The detour would add another 15 minutes to her journey, but she knew these streets like the back of her hand. She'd walked them as a child, ran them as a teenager, and now drove them as a professional, each corner holding a memory. The detour took her past her old high school, its football field now dark and quiet. She smiled, remembering the nights she'd spent in the library there, dreaming of a future where she could make a difference. Her debate team trophy still stood in the school's display case, a small victory that had helped pave the way to law school. Rose checked her rearview mirror, noticing a patrol car several cars behind. Her hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel, an old habit she'd learned from her father. "Always be alert, always be respectful, but always know your rights," he taught her and her siblings around the dinner table. The patrol car's lights suddenly flashed to life, and Rose's heart rate quickened. She glanced at her speedometer. She was exactly at the limit. Her registration was current, lights all working. She checked them just yesterday. Years of legal training kicked in as she began mentally documenting every detail of the moment. As she carefully signaled and pulled over, Rose took a deep breath. The weight of her law degree, her professional success, and her family's hopes sat heavy on her shoulders. In her rearview mirror, she watched the officer emerge from his vehicle, his hand already resting on his weapon. The evening that had started so ordinarily was about to become anything but. Rose's fingers brushed against her father's journal in her briefcase. Whatever happened next would be another story to write down. Another fight in the long journey toward justice. She reached for her registration and insurance cards, her movements deliberate and calm, even as her mind raced with the implications of what was unfolding. The officer's flashlight beam cut through her rear window, harsh and bright against the gathering dusk. Rose straightened her shoulders, channeling the strength of generations before her. She was no longer just Attorney Collins of Madison and Pierce law firm. At this moment, she was her grandmother's granddaughter, her father's daughter, and her community's advocate. Little did either of them know, but this encounter would soon become more than just another traffic stop. It would become a catalyst for change, a moment that would challenge the very foundations of law enforcement in their city. But for now, Rose sat quietly, her hands visible on the steering wheel, waiting for the first words that would set everything in motion. The beam of the flashlight swept through Rose's car, casting harsh shadows across her dashboard. Her grandmother's photo seemed to glow in the artificial light, a silent witness to what was unfolding. Officer Brooks, she could see his nameplate now, approached her window with an unmistakable swagger that made her lawyer's instincts prickle with concern. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with the customary greeting. His tone carried an edge that seemed out of place for a routine traffic stop. Rose kept her movements slow and deliberate, years of professional experience helping her maintain composure. "Of course, officer," she replied calmly, her voice steady despite the tension building in her chest. "My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them now." Officer Brooks didn't acknowledge her words, his flashlight beam following her every movement with unnecessary intensity. The night had grown darker, and the occasional passing car cast moving shadows across the scene. Rose could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" she inquired professionally, handling her documents with the same care she'd use in court. The question was standard, one she'd advised countless clients to ask, yet Officer Brooks's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. "You were swerving," he snapped, though both of them knew it wasn't true. Rose had been driving as carefully as always, especially after noticing the patrol car. She'd spent too many years advocating for others to make such a basic mistake. "I respectfully disagree, officer," she stated, her voice remaining professional. "I've been driving carefully and within the speed limit." The dashcam would later confirm her words, but in that moment, her truthful statement seemed to anger the officer further. Officer Brooks leaned closer to her window, his demeanor growing more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand moving to rest on his weapon. The gesture wasn't subtle, it wasn't meant to be. It was a clear show of authority, one that Rose had seen too many times in case files across her desk. "Officer, I don't believe that's necessary," she responded, still maintaining her composure. "I've provided my documentation, and I'm happy to discuss any traffic concerns you have." Her legal training was kicking in, each word carefully chosen to de-escalate the situation while asserting her rights. The radio in Officer Brooks's patrol car crackled with distant dispatcher chatter, a reminder that they weren't entirely alone on this dark stretch of road. A few cars passed by slowly, their drivers casting curious glances at the scene. Rose noticed one vehicle slow down significantly, likely someone recording on their phone, a sad reality of modern encounters with law enforcement. "I won't ask again," Officer Brooks growled, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Exit the vehicle now." His free hand reached for her door handle, a clear violation of procedure that Rose's legal mind automatically noted. Rose took a deep breath, remembering her father's words about staying calm in these situations. She knew her rights, but she also knew the reality of power dynamics in these encounters. With deliberate movements, she unbuckled her seatbelt. "I'm opening my door now, officer," she announced clearly, making sure her words would be picked up by both his body camera and her phone, which she discreetly set to record when she first pulled over. The evening air felt cooler now as she stepped out, her heels clicking softly on the asphalt. Officer Brooks immediately invaded her personal space, his aggressive stance making his intentions clear. "Hands where I can see them," he demanded, though her hands were already visible, held slightly away from her body in a non-threatening pose. "My hands are visible, officer," Rose stated for the record, her voice carrying the same professional tone she used in courtroom proceedings. "I want to be clear that I'm complying with your instructions while asserting my right to be treated with respect." The situation was escalating, and Rose could feel it. Years of handling similar cases had taught her the warning signs. Officer Brooks's body language, his aggressive tone, the way he positioned himself between her and his patrol car's dash cam, it all pointed to what might come next. A car passing by slowed down again, its headlights illuminating the scene briefly. Rose caught a glimpse of someone holding up a phone through their passenger window. In the distance, another patrol car's lights flashed into view, likely responding to a signal from Officer Brooks. "You people always think you know the law," Officer Brooks sneered, his words heavy with implications that made Rose's heart beat faster. But she wasn't just any citizen being profiled, she was an attorney who'd spent years fighting against exactly this type of behavior. "Officer," she responded, her voice clear and steady, "I am a licensed attorney, and I'm very aware that your current conduct is problematic. I suggest we wait for your supervisor to arrive." It was a professional courtesy, an attempt to give him an opportunity to step back from the edge he seemed determined to cross. But Officer Brooks wasn't interested in de-escalation. His hand gripped his weapon tighter, a motion Rose recognized from countless case files she'd reviewed. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," he ordered, his voice carrying a threat that needed no explanation. Rose complied, her movements still measured and calm, even as her mind raced through statutes and precedents. She could hear the second patrol car getting closer, its siren now silent but lights still flashing. Whatever happened next would be witnessed not just by the growing number of bystanders, but by the cameras she knew were recording. "I want to state clearly for the record," she said, her voice carrying the strength of someone who'd spent years in courtrooms, "that I am complying with all lawful orders while reserving my right to challenge any violations of procedure." The sound of Officer Brooks unclipping his handcuffs echoed in the night air. Rose stood perfectly still, her hands planted firmly on her car's roof, her reflection barely visible in the window. In it, she could see the same determination that had carried her through law school, through difficult cases, through every challenge that had tried to stop her from achieving her goals. This encounter was about to become more than just another traffic stop. It would become evidence, a case study, perhaps even a catalyst for change. But in that moment, as Officer Brooks moved behind her with his handcuffs ready, Rose was focused on one thing: surviving the next few minutes with dignity and purpose intact. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, each moment crystal clear in Rose's mind. As Officer Brooks reached for her arm, his grip unnecessarily harsh, she felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. The same feeling she'd experienced countless times during her morning self-defense classes at Master Chen's dojo. "You're hurting me," she stated clearly, her voice steady enough to be picked up by all recording devices present. "There's no need for this level of force." The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones out, their presence both a comfort and a concern. More witnesses meant more evidence, but it also meant more people potentially seeing what might come next. Officer Brooks's response was to twist her arm harder. "Stop resisting," he barked, though she was clearly compliant. The pain shot through her shoulder, a deliberate application of force that Rose recognized from her legal cases, a tactic meant to provoke a reaction that could justify escalation. But Rose wasn't just any citizen being manhandled. 10 years of martial arts training under Master Chen's guidance had taught her more than just self-defense. It had taught her control, awareness, and the importance of protecting herself while avoiding unnecessary conflict. "I am not resisting," she announced loudly and clearly, her legal mind still documenting every detail. "However, I have the right to protect myself from excessive force." The words were deliberate, meant for the cameras she knew were recording, establishing the legal framework for what she might need to do next. The second patrol car had pulled up now, its lights casting alternating patterns of red and blue across the scene. Officer Brooks seemed to take this as a signal to escalate further, attempting to slam her against the vehicle with unnecessary force. That's when Rose's training kicked in. In one fluid motion, she redirected his momentum, using his own force against him just as Master Chen had taught her. Officer Brooks stumbled, thrown off balance by his own aggressive action. Rose maintained her defensive stance, hands open and visible. "I am not attacking you," she declared firmly, her voice carrying across the now silent street. "I am protecting myself from unlawful assault while remaining in full compliance with all legal orders." The gathered crowd murmured, phones still recording every moment. Officer Brooks regained his footing, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. His hand moved toward his weapon, but Rose's voice cut through the tension. "Think carefully about your next action, officer. You have multiple witnesses and cameras recording your conduct." The second officer, Lieutenant Wilson, according to her nameplate, finally approached the scene. Her presence changed the dynamic immediately. "What's the situation here?" she asked, her tone professional and measured. "This woman assaulted an officer," Brooks spat out, but his hand moved away from his weapon. The lieutenant's arrival had forced him to reconsider his approach. "That's incorrect," Rose responded calmly. "I'm an attorney, and I defended myself against excessive force while remaining compliant with all lawful orders. Everything is on camera, including Officer Brooks's inappropriate conduct from the moment he approached my vehicle." The crowd had grown larger now, their presence creating an impromptu gallery of witnesses. Someone in the back called out, "I got it all on video." Others nodded in agreement, phones still raised and recording. Lieutenant Wilson assessed the situation quickly, her experienced eyes taking in the scene. "Officer Brooks, step back," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. To Rose, she said, "Ma'am, are you injured?" Rose maintained her professional composure, though her shoulder ached where Brooks had twisted it. "Yes, I believe I'll have bruising from Officer Brooks's excessive force. I'd like to file a formal complaint and request medical attention to document my injuries." The lieutenant nodded, her demeanor remaining neutral but professional. "Medical assistance is already on the way. Would you please explain to me what happened from the beginning?" As Rose began her account, more patrol cars arrived, their lights creating a surreal atmosphere on the normally quiet street. She noticed local residents emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Among them, she recognized Mrs. Washington from the corner house, a retired civil rights attorney who had mentored her during law school. Officer Brooks stood to the side now, his earlier bravado deflated under the watchful eyes of his superior and the dozens of cameras still recording. Rose continued her statement, her voice clear and professional, recounting each detail with the precision of a seasoned attorney. "I'd like to add," she concluded, "that this incident reflects a larger pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed. I've handled similar cases in my practice, but experiencing it firsthand reinforces the urgent need for reform." Lieutenant Wilson listened carefully, taking notes. In the distance, the ambulance's lights appeared, adding to the kaleidoscope of emergency lights that had transformed the street into an impromptu stage for what would soon become a landmark case. The paramedics approached with their equipment, and Rose allowed them to examine her shoulder while continuing to document everything that had occurred. She knew that this moment, as uncomfortable and unjust as it was, would become evidence in a larger fight for justice. Mrs. Washington had made her way through the crowd, her presence adding another layer of legal expertise to the scene. "Do you need a witness statement?" she called out, her voice carrying the weight of decades of civil rights experience. Rose managed a small smile, recognizing how this moment was bringing together different generations of legal advocates. "Yes," she replied, "I believe we'll need everyone's statements for what comes next." The night air had grown cooler, but the energy of the moment kept everyone alert and engaged. This wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. It was about standing up against systemic issues while maintaining dignity and professionalism. Rose knew that her response to this situation would become a template for others facing similar circumstances. As the paramedics documented her injuries and Lieutenant Wilson continued gathering statements, Rose silently thanked her younger self for all those early morning training sessions with Master Chen. Physical defense skills, combined with legal knowledge and professional poise, had transformed what could have been a tragic encounter into a powerful statement about rights, respect, and resistance. The emergency room buzzed with its usual late-night activity as Rose sat on the examination table, her navy blazer carefully folded beside her. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows that made the developing bruises on her arm look even more stark against her skin. A nurse photographed each injury, carefully documenting everything for the official record. "These pictures will help your case," the nurse said softly, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. "I've seen too many similar situations, but rarely does someone have the courage and the skills to stand up for themselves like you did." Outside the examination room, Rose could hear the murmur of voices. Word had spread quickly through the community, and several of her law firm colleagues had arrived to show support. The waiting room had transformed into an impromptu legal command center, with phones buzzing and hushed conversations about strategy and next steps. "How are you holding up?" asked her law partner, who had rushed to the hospital as soon as he received her call. His tie was loosened, and his normally pristine suit showed signs of a hastily interrupted dinner. He held up his tablet, showing Rose the videos already circulating on social media. "I'm okay," she replied, watching the footage of her encounter with Officer Brooks. The multiple camera angles from bystanders provided clear evidence of everything that had transpired. The truth is right there in those videos, no spinning this story into something it wasn't. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the incident. News outlets were calling, civil rights organizations were reaching out, and messages of support were flooding in from community members. But among all the notifications, one text message stood out from her old mentor at the public defender's office. "You just opened the door for change. Let's make it count." The examining doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "The good news is nothing's broken," she stated, reviewing the x-rays. "But these bruises and soft tissue injuries, they tell a story of excessive force. I'm documenting everything in detail for your records." Rose nodded, her mind already working through the legal implications. The doctor's report would be crucial evidence, adding medical testimony to the growing mountain of proof against Officer Brooks. As she listened to the doctor's findings, she could hear more commotion in the hallway. "The police chief is here," her law partner announced, stepping back into the room. "And you won't believe who else, Judge Thompson from the federal court. This is getting attention at levels we hadn't anticipated." The atmosphere in the hospital had shifted. What started as a routine emergency room visit had evolved into something much larger. Hospital security had to establish a perimeter to keep eager reporters at bay, while inside, a steady stream of legal observers and community leaders arrived to offer support. "Your grandmother would be proud," whispered Mrs. Washington, who had followed Rose to the hospital. The elderly civil rights attorney's presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the generations of struggle that had led to this moment. "She always said you'd be the one to make real change happen." The police chief's arrival created a stir in the hallway. Through the partially open door, Rose could see him in discussion with Lieutenant Wilson, their expressions grave as they reviewed footage from the body cameras. The chief's presence this early in the process was unprecedented, a sign that the department recognized the severity of the situation. "We need to talk about next steps," her law partner said, pulling up a chair. "The media's already running with this story. We need to control the narrative while everything's fresh." He paused, looking at Rose with concern. "But first, are you sure you're up for what's coming? This is going to be big." Rose glanced at her reflection in the window. Despite the bruises and the disheveled hair, she saw strength in her eyes. The same strength she'd seen in her grandmother's gaze when she told stories about fighting for civil rights in her day. "I'm ready," she replied. "This isn't just about me anymore." Outside the hospital windows, she could see the growing crowd of supporters gathering with candles and signs. The local community had mobilized with remarkable speed, transforming a personal incident into a rallying cry for change. Social media was ablaze with the hashtag #StandWithRose as her story resonated with people across the city. The nurse returned with discharge papers, but they were more than just medical documents. "These records are your evidence," she explained, her voice carrying years of experience with similar cases. "I've made sure every detail is properly documented. The system only changes when we have proof they can't ignore. As Rose prepared to leave the hospital, her legal team had already begun coordinating with civil rights organizations and community leaders. The incident was rapidly evolving from a single act of misconduct into a catalyst for systemic reform. The department's trying to get ahead of this, her law partner reported, showing her a press release that had just been issued. They're already talking about an internal investigation, but we all know that's not enough, not this time. The night had grown late, but the energy hadn't diminished. As Rose gathered her belongings, she could hear chants for justice echoing from outside. The community wasn't going to let this fade away into another forgotten incident report. Remember, Mrs. Washington said, helping Rose with her coat, movements start with moments like this. When one person stands up, others find the courage to follow. The elderly attorney's words carried the weight of historical perspective, drawing a line from past struggles to present opportunities. As Rose prepared to face the media gathered outside, she felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. This wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong, it was about seizing a moment to push for real change. The bruises would heal, but the impact of this night was just beginning to unfold. The law firm's conference room had transformed into a war room over the past week. Stacks of files covered the long table, each one telling a similar story. Complaints against Officer Brooks that had been buried, dismissed, or forgotten. Rose stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the city skyline in shades of gold and pink. "You need to see this," called out her investigator, waving a folder that looked older than the others. His tie was loose, and empty coffee cups scattered around his workspace showed the long hours he'd been putting in. Found it in the archives. A complaint from 5 years ago that never made it to review. Rose walked over, the slight soreness in her shoulder a constant reminder of her own encounter. The yellowed pages told a story that was becoming all too familiar. Another traffic stop, another instance of excessive force, another case where the truth had been buried under paperwork and procedure. "That makes 17, said her law partner, updating the board where they tracked their findings. The wall had become a timeline of Officer Brooks's career, each incident marked with a red pin. The pattern was undeniable. A clear history of targeting specific communities. The door opened, and Lieutenant Wilson entered, carrying more files. Since that night, she had become an unexpected ally, her own conscience pushing her to help expose the truth. Internal Affairs tried to bury these, she said, placing the stack on the table. But I made copies before they could lose them. Rose picked up the first file, its contents revealing a disturbing pattern. He was reported by his own partners, she murmured, scanning the documents. 3 different officers filed concerns about his behavior. All of them were transferred to different precincts within months. The investigation had grown beyond just one incident. Each day brought new witnesses forward, encouraged by Rose's stand. Community members who had stayed silent for years now felt empowered to share their stories. The wall of the conference room had become a tapestry of shared experiences, each one adding strength to their case. The police union's trying to spin this, her media consultant reported, tablet in hand. They're pushing the one bad apple narrative. But these files, she gestured to the stacks of evidence, they show it's the whole barrel that needs examining. Rose's phone buzzed. Another message from her grandmother's old friend, now a retired judge. Remember, it read, change happens when truth meets courage. Keep digging. The support from veteran civil rights advocates had been overwhelming, each one recognizing the potential impact of this case. The door opened again, this time revealing a young officer Rose hadn't met before. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as he entered. "I have something you need to see," he said, pulling out a USB drive. Dash cam footage they didn't want found. The team gathered around a laptop as the footage played. The images were grainy but clear enough. Officer Brooks, 2 years ago, using the same aggressive tactics. The video had been marked for deletion, but somehow survived in the system's backup files. "This is bigger than Brooks," Lieutenant Wilson said, her voice heavy with realization. "The system's designed to protect itself. Each covered-up incident, each buried complaint. It's all part of a pattern." Rose's investigator called out from his corner, where he'd been analyzing department records. Found something interesting in the transfer patterns. Every time there's a complaint, there's a shuffle. move the problem around instead of fixing it. The wall of evidence had grown so extensive that they'd had to expand to a second room. Photos, statements, official reports, and unofficial notes, each piece adding to the larger picture of systemic issues that had gone unchecked for years. A knock at the door revealed Mrs. Washington, the retired civil rights attorney who'd been mentoring Rose since law school. She carried a box of old case files. "These are from similar cases in the 90s, she explained. "The patterns haven't changed, just the dates and names." Rose picked up one of the older files, its pages yellow with age. The similarities to current complaints were striking. Same tactics, same excuses, same system protecting itself. "They never expected anyone to connect the dots," she said, adding the historical cases to their timeline. The investigation had taken on a life of its own. Other law firms had offered resources, civil rights organizations provided research support, and even some retired officers had come forward with information. The wall of silence was crumbling, one testimony at a time. Chief's office called again. Her law partner announced, "They're offering a deal, willing to terminate Brooks if we keep the investigation limited to him." The room fell silent, everyone looking to Rose for her response. She walked to the evidence wall, touching one of the oldest complaints, a case from 10 years ago that had been dismissed without investigation. "This was never about one officer," she said firmly. "It's about a system that protected him, promoted him, and punished those who tried to speak up." Lieutenant Wilson nodded in agreement. "The department needs this exposed," she said. "We can't fix what we pretend isn't broken." The young officer who'd brought the dash cam footage spoke up. "There are others like me in the force," he said quietly. "Officers who want change but were afraid to speak up. Your stand gave us courage." Outside the conference room windows, the city continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the mounting evidence that promised to shake its foundations. Rose looked at the wall of testimonies and evidence, each piece representing someone who'd been silenced, ignored, or afraid to speak up. "We keep going," she announced to the room. "Every file, every complaint, every covered-up incident, we bring it all to light. This isn't just about justice for one night, it's about changing the system that made that night possible." As the team returned to their tasks, Rose noticed a small note that had fallen from one of the older files. It was a simple message from someone whose complaint had been dismissed years ago. "Someone please listen." Now finally, those voices would be heard. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and supporters as Rose walked up, her legal team flanking her sides. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps, and the air was charged with anticipation. This wasn't just another day in court, it was the beginning of a trial that could change everything. "Ready?" her lead co-counsel whispered, adjusting his tie as they approached the heavy wooden doors. The question was about more than just the opening arguments they'd rehearsed. It was about facing what waited inside. Officer Brooks, the police union lawyers, and a system that had resisted change for decades. Inside the courtroom, every bench was filled. Community members sat shoulder to shoulder with law enforcement officials, retired judges next to civil rights activists. Mrs. Washington, now using a cane but still sharp as ever, had claimed a front row seat. Her presence was a bridge between past struggles and present hopes. "All rise," called the bailiff, and Judge Chen entered the courtroom. She was known for her fairness and attention to detail, exactly what they needed for a case this complex. The rustle of people standing filled the room, then silence fell as the proceedings began. Rose's opening statement had been carefully crafted over countless late nights, each word chosen to paint a clear picture. "This case is about more than one night on a dark street," she began, her voice steady and clear. "It's about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long." As she spoke, the evidence they'd gathered over months of investigation was displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. Dashcam videos, body camera footage, witness statements, and department records, each piece telling part of a larger story. "The defense would have you believe this is about one officer, one incident," she continued, gesturing to where Officer Brooks sat with his lawyers. "But the evidence will show a system that not only allowed such behavior but protected and perpetuated it." The police union's legal team was formidable, 5 high-powered attorneys with decades of experience defending officers. Their opening statement tried to paint Rose as the aggressor, but the videos told a different story. Every angle, Every frame supported her account. Day after day, witnesses took the stand. Former officers who'd tried to report Brooks's behavior shared their stories of retaliation. Community members spoke about similar encounters that had been brushed aside. Department records revealed a pattern of complaints disappearing into administrative black holes. "Did you fear for your life?" the defense attorney asked Rose during cross-examination, his tone suggesting she had overreacted. The courtroom held its breath as she answered, "I feared for every person who'd faced similar treatment without the legal knowledge or resources to defend themselves," she replied, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "I feared for a community that had learned to expect abuse rather than protection." Lieutenant Wilson's testimony proved crucial. As a senior officer speaking against her own department, her words carried special weight. "The system isn't designed to fix problems," she testified. "It's designed to hide them, move them around, protect itself at all costs." The young officer who'd provided the hidden dash cam footage faced intense pressure from the defense team. But he held firm, explaining how evidence of misconduct was routinely buried or deleted. His testimony opened the door for others to come forward. Technical experts analyzed the department's complaint system, revealing how reports of misconduct were systematically downgraded or misclassified. Statistical analysis showed clear patterns in how certain officers were protected while complainants were intimidated or ignored. Rose's law partner handled the financial aspects, showing how taxpayer money had been used to settle similar cases quietly, with no real changes made to prevent future incidents. The numbers were staggering. Millions spent to maintain the status quo rather than reform the system. The defense tried to paint Brooks as a dedicated officer working in difficult conditions. But under cross-examination, his record unraveled. Previous partners testified about witnessing similar incidents. Internal affairs files showed complaints going back years, each one disappeared into the bureaucracy. Mrs. Washington took the stand as an expert witness, her decades of civil rights experience providing historical context. "The methods have become more sophisticated," she testified, "but the underlying issues remain the same. The system protects itself at the expense of justice." As weeks of testimony continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Even some of the officers present began nodding at key points of evidence. The truth was becoming undeniable, documented in countless files, videos, and testimonies. The police union offered another deal, bigger than before. They'd accept major reforms, mandatory retraining, and Brooks's termination. But Rose and her team stood firm. The community deserved full transparency and real change, not just promises. "Look at the faces in this courtroom," Rose said during her closing argument, gesturing to the packed benches. "Each person here represents countless others who couldn't speak up, who were silenced, who gave up hope for justice. This case is their voice." Outside, the crowds had grown larger. People gathered daily, holding signs and sharing stories of their own encounters with police misconduct. The case had become a symbol of hope, proof that the system could be challenged and changed. The jury deliberation room was filled with boxes of evidence, files, recordings, testimonies about years of systematic misconduct. Each piece they'd uncovered was another thread in the tapestry of truth they'd woven over months of investigation. As they waited for the verdict, Rose sat in the quiet courtroom, thinking about her grandmother's words about standing up for what's right. The bruises from that night had long since faded, but the impact of what they'd uncovered would last far longer. The case had already sparked changes. Other departments across the country were reviewing their complaint procedures. Police unions were facing pressure to stop protecting officers with histories of misconduct. The wall of silence was beginning to crack. The morning the verdict was due, the city seemed to hold its breath. People gathered outside the courthouse hours before the proceedings were set to begin. Community members who'd followed the case from the beginning stood alongside new supporters, all united in their hope for change. Rose arrived early, walking through the crowd that parted respectfully to let her pass. Many reached out to touch her shoulder or whisper words of thanks. A group of young law students stood near the steps, notebooks in hand, watching the woman who'd shown them that one person really could make a difference. "Whatever happens today," her law partner said as they climbed the courthouse steps, "you've already changed things. Look around." He gestured to the diverse crowd. people from all walks of life who'd been drawn together by this fight for justice. Inside, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Extra chairs had been brought in, but still, people lined the walls. Mrs. Washington sat in her usual front row seat, her hands folded over her cane, her eyes bright with anticipation. Lieutenant Wilson and several other officers who testified sat together, their presence a statement in itself. The young officer who'd provided the crucial dash cam footage caught Rose's eye and nodded. He was in uniform today, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Behind him sat 3 other officers who'd come forward during the trial, each one representing a growing movement for change within the department. "All rise," called the bailiff, and Judge Chen entered. The room fell silent as she took her seat. The jury filed in moments later, their faces serious with the weight of their decision. Rose could feel her heart pounding, but her hands were steady as she stood. The jury forewoman stood, holding the verdict form. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as she began to read. In the matter of misconduct and civil rights violations, each word seemed to echo off the walls. As the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted. Years of pent-up emotion released in a wave of tears, hugs, and quiet exclamations of thank you. Officer Brooks slumped in his chair as the full impact of the decision hit him. But the verdict was just the beginning. Judge Chen's ruling went beyond individual punishment. She mandated comprehensive reforms, new training programs, independent oversight committees, transparent complaint procedures, and regular audits of officer conduct. This case, she stated firmly, has exposed not just individual misconduct, but systemic failures that must be addressed. The court orders the following reforms. Her list was comprehensive, touching every aspect of department operations, from hiring practices to accountability measures. Outside, as news of the verdict spread, the crowd's cheers echoed off the surrounding buildings. Reporters rushed to share the news, their cameras capturing the moment when years of work finally paid off. "Justice!" someone shouted, and the cry was taken up by hundreds of voices. Rose stepped out into the sunlight, and the cheering grew louder. Mrs. Washington made her way through the crowd to stand beside her, tears streaming down her face. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she whispered, squeezing Rose's hand. Lieutenant Wilson approached next, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We've got a lot of work ahead to implement these changes, but now we have the tools to do it right." The young officer who'd provided the dash cam footage was surrounded by his colleagues, not in anger, but in support. More officers were stepping forward, ready to be part of the change rather than resist it. The blue wall of silence was crumbling, replaced by a commitment to transparency and accountability. Rose's phone buzzed with messages from across the country. Other departments requesting guidance on implementing similar reforms, law schools asking her to speak about the case, civil rights organizations offering partnerships. The ripples of change were spreading far beyond their city. At the community center that evening, people gathered to celebrate. The old building, once threatened with closure, was now set to become a training center for police-community relations. Rose watched as officers mingled with community members, sharing stories and building bridges that had seemed impossible just months ago. Her law partner approached with a stack of papers. "You won't believe how many other cases are coming forward," he said. "People who've been afraid to speak up for years are finally finding their voice." This verdict gave them hope. The celebration was interrupted by breaking news, the police chief announcing his retirement and recommending Lieutenant Wilson as his replacement. "The department needs new leadership," he admitted in his statement. "Leaders who understand that protecting the community means being accountable to it." Rose found a quiet moment to visit her grandmother's old office in the community center. The certificate she'd earned for her years of civil rights work still hung on the wall. Below it, someone had pinned a newspaper headline about the verdict, "Past and present, linked in an ongoing fight for justice." As she looked out the window at the gathering below, Rose saw something her grandmother had always talked about: real change happening not through force, but through understanding and determination. Officers and community members were talking, sharing experiences, finding common ground. The young law students who'd watched the trial had set up a booth to help people understand their rights and the new accountability measures. Retired officers were sharing stories about why these changes were necessary. Even some of Officer Brooks's former supporters were admitting the need for reform. Mrs. Washington joined her at the window. "You know," she said softly, "change never comes easy. But when it comes from truth and justice, it sticks. What you did, what we all did together, that's going to last." Rose nodded, watching as more people arrived at the center. Each person represented a story, a hope, a piece of the change they'd fought so hard to achieve. The victory wasn't just in the courtroom, it was in every conversation happening below, every new understanding being formed. Ready to get back to work? Her law partner asked from the doorway. "We've got departments across the country asking for help implementing these reforms. This could be the start of something big." Rose took one last look at her grandmother's certificate, then turned toward the future they'd all fought to create. The real work was just beginning, but now they had proof that change was possible. One person's stand for justice had become a movement for reform, and that movement was just getting started.